Good morning. This is actually the first time I've been back in the sanctuary since the pandemic began. So it's been over a year and a half. Last weekend, we were on the Zoom breakout session, and in that session, folks ranged in age from 29 to 103. And I was touched by the fact that those of you who have worked hard behind the scenes to put this service online and create opportunities for us to continue to connect with each other have had a real positive impact on all of us, especially those like me who cannot come to the service for a while. Bob this morning asked us to start thinking differently, and I had to laugh. I didn't know what he was going to talk about today. And that profile that he described, unfortunately, it does apply to me, and so this is my moment to share gratitude with you. I listened to the past talks because they're online, and I remain grateful to be part of this faith community. But as I was listening to those videos, I was wondering if you have something that you do daily that's a ritual or a practice that helps you maintain an attitude of gratitude. I know some people write in journals, pray, meditate, some of us even sing. We take long walks or go for long runs, and most of us volunteer in a number of ways. I knit. I learned how to knit as a child and then put those needles away for years as I focused on my career and education. And I only pulled them out again when I had to sit for long patches of time with my parents when they were elders. I wanted a way to stay present with them, to not be distracted with my phone and all the other commitments coming in with my life, and so I started knitting again. Knitting also brings back memories from my childhood, memories of the people who raised me and helped to raise me and taught me how to live with gratitude amid adversity. I'm going to share briefly 3 of their stories, but first, I also, because I do think different, I thought, well, what is it exactly that stops people from having an attitude of gratitude? And it turns out the research says that it's scarcity. It's scarcity that drives people to behave in an opposite way from someone who lives with gratitude, to be more selfish, to be more competitive with others, to be less grateful. And we saw that, didn't we, at the start of the pandemic when everyone was hoarding toilet paper of all things, and then when the vaccines were available and people were scrambling online to get appointments and for their grandparents or for themselves or for their parents. So it is scarcity that can drive us to be more self-absorbed. And yet over time, as Bob suggested, that this endless uncertainty or adversity forces us to adopt either an attitude of cynicism or self-centeredness, or an attitude of gratitude and the action that flows from that. Now, I learned that about that choice as an adolescent. Ray and I, as some of you know, moved to Princeton when our children were 3 and 3 years of age. Moved to Concord from Princeton, New Jersey. We didn't have jobs in Massachusetts. We moved back here so I could live closer to my parents, who both of them were seriously ill. Now, the neighborhood in which my parents lived was the one in which I was raised. And there were about 60 houses, all sort of cookie cutter in nature, all built at the same time in the 50s. And in each of those homes, for the most part, with a few exceptions, the dads were veterans. My dad was one as well. Most of the veterans were from World War II, but there were some younger dads who were veterans of the Korean War. I always tell teenagers, just think about what it's like to grow up in a neighborhood where everybody knows you and all of the dads are combat veterans. nobody really got far out of line. But if you think back, these were men who at 18 or 19 or 20 years of age lived with the deaths of friends in battle. They witnessed firsthand the widespread destruction of communities, of lives, the cruelties of war. And yet they came home and they quietly built lives that would honor the lives of the people who didn't return. Now, these men and women, because one of my aunts was also a veteran from that time, they had survived the worst, but they had decided they would make the most of their time left, living simplified lives, but always generous with their time for families and neighbors and the communities in which they lived. When I was growing up in their midst, only 30% of the kids who graduated from high school with me went on to college. So what did everybody else do? Well, the boys became plumbers, electricians, they learned trades, some were firefighters and police officers. But from the time I was in elementary school through my sophomore year in high school, many of those boys followed their graduation ceremonies with a trip to Asia. Now, they were not going on a gap year, and their parents were not sending them on vacation, but they were drafted, and they went over to Vietnam to fight the war. In fact, there were so many boys from my hometown of 45,000 people who wound up in Vietnam that one year the entire draft board quit in protest. Unfortunately, to no avail. It didn't surprise me to learn that of the last 2 soldiers to die in that war, one of them came from my hometown. Just the year before, he had been selected as the Boy of the Year at the local Boys and Girls Club. And while his parents grieved over their loss, they also lived with gratitude that that war had finally ended and nobody else's sons would have to die in battle. Now, when I was in high school, my town became famous. I belonged to a youth group, just like the youth group here in a congregational church, and we met with other youth groups in other parts of town, including the Methodist Church, where one mother approached the minister asking for help because something really odd was going on in her neighborhood. In nearly every household, there was at least one child who was diagnosed with cancer. Now, she had gone to public officials and the health board, and nobody really believed her that there had to be something in the environment, in their school, there had to be something wrong, and that minister listened. And he did help, and it turned out that she was right. The water the children were drinking and bathing in was drawn from a city well that was heavily contaminated with chlorinated solvents. City well was situated near a field that was known to have toxic hides from tanning, and the chemicals leached through the soil into the groundwater and into the city well that was drawn into their homes. That neighborhood became the test case for the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency that sued the company for not having cleaned up that waste. Now that test case went on and on and on. The litigation was endless because, of course, there were no protocols in place. But a book was written about that community. It was called A Civil Action, and a movie was made from that starred John Travolta, and young people say, ooh, John Travolta, but he was the George Clooney of the time, so it got a lot of attention. The moms and dads who were involved in the suit got very little money, if anything, from that lawsuit. It all went to legal fees, but that wasn't the point. They were very grateful that their situation got a lot of attention. That well was finally closed, and equally important, the EPA now had a precedent, and as we all know, went on to put all companies on notice that they were expected to clean up the waste, and they would be held accountable if they didn't. And today, as you know, you can't study environmental law without learning about the children from Woburn, Massachusetts. So why do I tell you these stories? The families from my childhood are like millions of families across the country today. They had little material wealth. They lived from paycheck to paycheck, and some barely did so. And they experienced ongoing adversity. The fathers fought the battles in World War II. The sons fought the battles in Vietnam. And they came home and settled in only to find that children were being poisoned from water from brushing their teeth. The researchers tell us that they should have been selfish, angry, cynical, and there was a little bit of that, and you can hear some of that in my voice even today. But they didn't hang on to those feelings, quite the opposite. And you probably know why. It's because they had a community-wide network of support. That neighborhood that I lived in, the ethos was one of shared resources. My sister and I had the only football in the neighborhood, so we were very popular with the boys. But when a neighbor became ill, if a vegetable garden had a banner crop, if a driveway needed to be shoveled or a baby shower needed to be planned, the neighbors rallied, and food and desserts and helping hands were available without asking. And when trouble arrived, as it always did, instead of cynicism or fear, friends brought laughter. Instead of isolation or loneliness, neighbors called and offered to help. Now, this pandemic we're living through has brought havoc to our lives, but it has brought true devastation in some communities and with some families. Adversity can destroy feelings of gratitude, something I learned as a child, but it also brings into sharp relief what is truly important and reminds us to demonstrate that attitude of gratitude through action and service to others. And so that's why I knit. I could simply buy the hats and afghans because scarcity, I grew up obviously in a community of scarcity, but I live in a community of abundance. And abundance can also create complexity. So this knitting forces me to slow down a bit. It connects me to the memories from my childhood, but it also reminds me not to become complacent and continue to look and see who else needs my support and our support. So I'll end by asking you again to reflect on what you do daily to maintain an attitude of gratitude, and more importantly, what action follows from that. And if you need to learn to knit, I'll be very happy to show you. Thank you.